The majority of the Earth's surface is covered in water, so aquatic biomes are quite important, particularly marine biomes, which make up about 3/4 of the Earth's surface. They're about 3% salt concentration in the water and have a very large impact on the biosphere. And they show less latitudinal variation than terrestrial biomes, but there is still some. And they also have quite a bit of vertical layering. Freshwater biomes have less than 0.1% of salt and are much rarer. They don't cover nearly as much of the Earth's surface. They're very, very linked to soils and also the biotic components of the surrounding terrestrial biome. Both freshwater and saltwater aquatic biomes have different zonations based on a lot of different factors, like whether light breaks through or how deep the water is. And so in a lake, you have the littoral zone, which is closer to the shore. It's shallower, and that means that plants can root in the bottom and stick up through the top. And then the limnetic zone is more open lake, right, where nothing is growing on the bottom and sticking out the top. You have similar zones in the ocean, like the neritic zone and the oceanic zone. Neritic being shallower and before you reach the continental shelf, and the oceanic zone being after the continental shelf. And then you have also an intertidal zone in marine ecosystems because the tides come in and out. So you have part of this area here that is covered by water during high tide and not covered by water during low tide. In both lakes and oceans, you have a photic zone at the top, which is the area where light can penetrate, and so you can have photosynthesis occurring. And then below the photic zone, you have an aphotic zone, which is so deep that very little light gets through, and so you can't have any photosynthesis going on. In both, you also have a benthic zone. And whether it's shallow or deep, the benthic just means the bottom, right? There are a lot of organisms that live on the bottom, and they tend to live off of what's sometimes called marine snow that falls from the top and lands on the bottom and is basically like dead organisms and poop. And that stuff's full of a lot of nutrients, and so it's a rich place to live in the benthic zone. And when you are very, very deep in the ocean, you have what's called the abyssal zone, like in the abyss. And this means you are very, very deep in the water. You also have what's called the pelagic zone, which essentially means open water, right? So whether you're in a lake or the ocean, when you're not near the shore, when you're in open water, that's the pelagic zone. Oceans and lakes that are deep enough have vertical stratification in temperature called a thermocline, where usually the top layer is a little warmer and the bottom layer is colder. And lakes often undergo twice a year a turnover, which is a mixing of the water where oxygenated water at the surface ends up sinking to the bottom and bringing oxygen down, and then at the bottom it turns up silt and brings some of that nutritious silt to the top. So you get oxygen from the top going to the bottom, nutrients from the bottom going to the top. And this happens because you've got, during this winter, very cold water. As you know, there's a weird thing where when water gets colder, it gets denser and denser and denser until it gets close to freezing, and then it expands because water is so polar that it forms essentially a crystal lattice. So it expands and ice floats. We talked about that in Bio 131. But then as it warms up in the spring, it no longer is ice, so it condenses a bit, and then it's just cold water that's dense, and it falls to the bottom, right? So whoosh, falls to the bottom. And again, that turns over water at the bottom that's then going to rise to the top as the cold water displaces it. And that allows you to mix oxygen and silt. And then in the summer, you've got warm water on top because it's expanded, and cold water in the bottom because it's dense. And then the autumn, you have the opposite happening, where the water begins to get colder at the top, and then it falls, right, and then that displaces water at the bottom, which moves up, and you have another round of mixing oxygenated water from the top and silty water from the bottom. The ocean is very different depending on where you are in terms of depth, and the vast majority of organisms occur in the relatively shallow photic zone because that's where photosynthesis can occur. It's where light penetrates, and so you have a big base to the food pyramid, And the aphotic zone is huge, but it does not have very much life compared to most other biomes. And this is a reminder of just how big the ocean biomes are, but again, they're very, very deep. The aphotic zone of the ocean is the biggest biome on Earth, but it's relatively devoid of life, at least less dense. But you can see here we have coral reefs close to a lot of these land masses in the shallows that are very, very productive. Let's look at a few aquatic biomes in some more detail. And again, these aquatic biomes can be characterized by the physical and chemical environments, geological features, the presence or absence of photosynthetic organisms and heterotrophs. Lakes are characterized by the fresh water that they have and the fact that the water isn't necessarily flowing like it would be in a river or a stream. And temperature can often give lakes a seasonal thermocline, like we talked about. Some lakes are relatively nutrient poor and oxygen rich, and we call these oligotrophic. Oligo means few, trophic refers to nutrients. So essentially that means relatively nutrient poor. Eutrophic lakes are nutrient rich. Eutrophic means like true nutrition. And these tend to be lower in oxygen because the animals and plants that live in it are sucking up the oxygen, specifically the animals and the microbes. Usually eutrophic lakes have more surface compared to depth than oligotrophic lakes, which may be smaller at the surface but very, very deep. And that way rooted and floating aquatic plants could live in those shallow areas, which we call the littoral zone, which is close to shore, so you can often have rooted plants that are able to stick out the top. In the limnetic zone, the water's too deep to have rooted plants, but you do have some phytoplankton and zooplankton that can graze on that phytoplankton. Generally, the benthic zone at the bottom is filled with invertebrates, which again are eating that poop and dead organisms stuff that falls down to the bottom. And fish can live in all of the zones as long as there's enough oxygen for those fish. Now, sometimes in very, very agriculture-heavy areas of the world, like Ohio, for instance, all those fertilizers that we dump, those artificial fertilizers on our fields, they get washed away in the rain, and they get washed into nearby streams and ultimately into lakes. And that lake then becomes very eutrophic, filled with nutrition. And that may seem good, but what that does is it allows for algal blooms, which then die, and then all that mass is eaten up by microbes, which then deplete the oxygen. And now you have a eutrophic lake with lots of nutrients, but very little oxygen, and it winds up killing all the fish. Here on the left, you can see an oligotrophic lake. It's very clear. You can see the bottom. That means not very much is living in it, but there's a lot of oxygen, so you usually have a lot more fish. Whereas here, the water is cloudy because it's full of silt probably and lots of nutrients, and you get lots of plants and algae, etc. And so you've probably seen lakes like both of these before. Habitats that are inundated by water at least some of the time and tend to have plants that are adapted to water-saturated soil, meaning soil that does not have much oxygen available, are called wetlands. And these often develop in shallow basins where water tends to collect, sometimes along the banks of rivers or the coasts of large bodies of water. Wetlands are actually very, very productive, and there's a lot of decomposition that goes on. They have plants like cattails and lilies, which you may have seen, black spruce, and a lot of invertebrates. And down southeast, you may see alligators, things like frogs, and birds, and otters. And we have destroyed the vast majority of wetlands in the country because they're not particularly pleasant. And now we're realizing that they provided a lot of ecological services for us. They tend to purify water and reduce flooding. Very often they prevent harmful hurricane surge from reaching very far inland in places like Louisiana. Here's an example of a wetland in a basin somewhere in the United Kingdom. You can see the water's not very deep, but the soil is saturated, and so there's not very much oxygen for the roots. The defining characteristic of streams and rivers is the fact that they flow, they have current. And usually the headwaters where they begin are cold and clear and turbulent, lots of oxygen. And downstream, as The water slows and gets bigger because more rivers combine. The water tends to be warmer, and it picks up silt along the way, and it tends to be meandering and a little bit slower. Here you can see the small rushing headwaters of a stream in the Great Smoky Mountains, and here you can see the Loire River in France, far, far from its headwaters, where it's sort of become large and meandering. Eventually, rivers run into the ocean, and this area where they meet the ocean is called an estuary, and the salinity is going to be weird, some mix of fresh and salt water, and in fact, it's going to vary as the tides rise and the tides fall. They tend to be very nutrient-rich and productive because you've been bringing silt down through the rivers, and so there's an interesting, complex network of usually channel islands and inlets and lots of different places for organisms to find niches to survive. This is a place where you have meeting of two different biomes, essentially. In those places, those edges tend to be very productive. You have lots of invertebrates and fish and waterfowl and marine mammals, and we eat a lot of them. Oysters, crabs, crawfish, and lots of other fish. And we've been interfering with a lot of these estuaries because we interfere upstream by building dams and rerouting things. This is an image of an estuary in the southeastern U.S. And again, you can see lots of little inlets and places for organisms to hide and make a living. At the edge of the ocean, you have intertidal zones, which literally means between tides, intertidal. And these are unique because they are submerged during high tide, and then at low tide they are exposed and are no longer submerged. And so these are unique challenges that organisms have to face. Usually the oxygen levels are pretty high, as are the nutrient levels. Substrate can be rocky or sandy, and all sorts of organisms like crabs and sea stars, etc., can live here. These are like tide pools. Here you can see a lot of bivalve mollusks and sea starry echinoderms, etc., and a lot of algae living in this unique environment. The open ocean, the ocean pelagic zone, is usually mixed up by wind-driven oceanic currents like we looked at earlier in the chapter, and oxygen levels are often high. And in tropical areas, nutrient levels aren't particularly high because there's not very much mixing. But in temperate and colder regions, you tend to have more mixing, and that's why, for instance, humpback whales go to Alaska in the summer to feed in those nutrient-rich waters. And this biome covers 7 out of 10 bits of the Earth's surface. The base of these food pyramids are phytoplankton and zooplankton, which are very tiny organisms. But there are also lots of free-swimming animals, squid and fish and jellyfish, etc. And your humpback whales, which spend their summers reproducing in the warm waters off of Hawaii. Coral reefs are one of the most productive ecosystems in the world. They're formed from cnidarians, corals, which build a calcium carbonate skeleton and form those reefs that you're used to seeing in the movies, that then are a place where lots of other organisms live. And they're shallow areas, and they form mutualistic relationships with some photosynthetic organisms, and they're very, very productive, usually a high oxygen concentration. And they're gorgeous. Because they're in the photic zone, there's lots of light that penetrates the surface. They tend to be very, very colorful, the fish and organisms that live there. The benthic zone is less beautiful, but it tends to be filled with nutrients and a very consistent temperature because you're insulated with lots of water, and you have lots of organisms that live, again, mostly on that marine snow, dead stuff, and poop that rains down from the upper layers of the ocean. Exceptions being the shallow areas, which are still benthic if you're on the bottom, where you can have seaweeds and algae and things that photosynthesize, or deep-sea hydrothermal vents, which have their own sources of nutrients with chemoautotrophic prokaryotes that take advantage of nutrients coming from these deep-sea vents in the abyssal zone, meaning way down in the abyss, very, very deep. And those chemoautotrophic prokaryotes form the base of a relatively thriving community that includes gigantic worms and crabs and all sorts of organisms that live off of that base.